from the state. And then what we have to do for the services we deliver, we've got to make sure that we right-size the services and focus on the must-have services rather than the nice-to-have services, and make sure they fit inside that budget. That's really what I think this exercise is all about.
Councilman, that's what we're saying in those recommendations, that we've got to look at the core services that we provide and make decisions from there.
Councilman
Thank you.
Benjamin, you had a question?
Yes, I did want to ask about the core services and exactly what you're intending there. Also, my other question is, since the fund balance reserve was set by ordinance by the council many years ago, what was the legal opinion as to giving into that since it wasn't mandated?
I would have to defer to the legal department. I'm not sure of that
I
response.
think it is a legal question,
Yeah.
but what I understand is that we're left with $1,385,619 in the reserve.
Yes, ma'am.
That's right. And the reason that we did this many years ago is to maintain the financial integrity of the city when it came to bond issue ratings and things like that,
Yes.
bond ratings. Mr. Anderson, could you help me with that question? Wouldn't that have required an action by the council to dip into that reserve since it was set by ordinance?
James Anderson, City Attorney's Office. In reference to that, you've got the council, the governing body that is responsible for setting the budget, for approving all bills,
Right.
and maintaining that. Although it is an ordinance, the ordinance is applicable to the governing body, who is the only entity capable of violating the ordinance. As to what the ramifications of that is hard to say. Of course, any violation of the ordinance there's limited penalties for doing that. In reference to that ordinance, it's more of an ordinance to put the governing authorities on notice and to be very cognizant of crossing that line, more so than establishing some type of criminal punishment or financial punishment to the persons who violate that. So at this point, having gone below that figure,
It's not below, it's depleted.
yeah. As a practical matter, that ceases to be the real issue at this point. I think that's something to look at subsequent to resolving the matter of getting back above that, as to how you're going to make certain that all the governing authorities are aware exactly when you're approaching that line, and take appropriate action when matters come up before you as to votes on expenditures and the like.
Well, the legal opinion in past years is that money was untouchable and would require action of the council to dip into that. And I'm no lawyer, but I don't see how you can do that without there being some consequence there.
All right, Mr. Stamps.
Let me just ask this question. The budget that was adopted, reflecting an amount in that budget less than the 7.5%?
Yes, it was.
So that's why I believe that we should be having these meetings behind closed doors. Transparency is wonderful, but a display like this, we need to sit down and go through these things. And when we come back before the people, we display a better conversation and let them have more confidence in the government that they've elected. I'm all for transparency, but something we're going to dive into things and then come back out at a higher level of conversation. And I think that's the route we should go in. our internal differences are not greater than our external threats. We have some external threats that are feeding off all this information and using them against us. So to take over our city, take over our resources, I believe that we should change this modality right now because of the environment. We're at war. And when you're at war, you don't just, you go behind closed doors and hash this stuff out. And then we can fuss and argue behind closed doors. Why? We don't have time to be in this internal strife mode. We must be in this unity mode to move the city forward.
Mr. Foote? I got an additional question here on the page, third page of this handout here, under, I guess it's question number 3. If so, what's the plan for replenishing the reserve? And point down here, number G, it says reduce funding provided to outside agencies. Can you tell me what the outside agencies in question, what some or all of those outside agencies are?
When I think about it, I think about the zoo, our libraries. We kind of tossed up the idea of maybe condensing the number of libraries we have. These were our recommendations. They would have to be, agreed upon by all parties. But, look at the attendance at some of them. If they aren't used to their full capacity, maybe we could look at condensing them. Because we do give a general fund appropriation to their operation. And
Are there any other agencies besides the zoo or library?
There are several agencies. The recommendation is pretty general. What we probably like to do is come back with some specific analysis that helps us to better determine which of those agencies are performing, which of those agencies we may determine have some waste, fraud, and abuse that we may need to look at reducing general fund allocation to. But again, ultimately, that decision will be the council's, and we'll make a presentation of that as soon as we can.
Do the Parks and Rec with the golf courses, would that fall under, do they get any money from the general fund, or is theirs all separate?
Most of those are typically non-revenue generating for the most part. When you look at what we put out to maintain, it's not just golf courses. It's several of the other things. Yeah, it's the planetarium. It's several of the other things.
So they get some funding from the general fund?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Stamps.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do we have a report from the budget analyst to just talk about where we are? We need some recommendations. I mean, I want to be as educated as possible on these issues, but more importantly, I just want the experts to be hired from the municipal advisor to Mr. Thomas, Mr. Hill, budget analyst, to give us some recommendations to choose from to move forward. I mean, I don't want to turn this into an academic process. I want to turn it into a decision-making and action process. And so I don't want to turn this into a budget meeting either, but if not this meeting, on Monday when we actually have a real budget meeting, could just bring us the recommendations.
Councilman, we're prepared to make recommendations right now.
And we can move forward, because I don't want to turn this into some kind of.
Let me see, James. Ms. Thomas, we normally would have folks sitting up here, but since you're the third party, we're gonna make you sit down there. All right.
Good morning.
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 Still morning. Michael Thomas, I'm with Systems Consultants. I'm also working with Rick Hill, who is the former CFO for the city of Jackson. So we have a series of recommendations, and we've been working with the finance staff on the numbers that you've been reviewing, and we've been working with them on some preliminary recommendations. So our report is actually due on Monday, but what I did is I lifted the recommendations from the report, and I can give you a copy of that. So while you're getting the recommendations I'm sending around, I wanted to mention that The scope of our work included reviewing the finance department and looking for efficiencies in operation, in addition to making some recommendations towards saving funds or creating new revenue opportunities for the city of Jackson. Want that? So as you look through the recommendations, you'll see that some of the recommendations are more internal efficiency improvement related, more than just creating revenue. But we do have a series of revenue, potentially significant revenue creating recommendations included as well. So I'm going to take the approach that I'm going to bypass the scope of work and reading that. I'm going to get into really what we think you need to do at this point, knowing where you are in the severity of the budget situation. So the first thing I'll tell you is that every effort that you make at this point to save the fund balance will obviously impact the fund balance positively. So one of the recommendations that we are making, and if you go to page 3, I think it's called page 3. I pulled the cover off and made a change that I need to look at. But if you go to page 3, you'll see where we start our series of recommendations. And again, this is based on our experience and what we had to do in similar situations. The first recommendation is that you freeze all non-essential spending. I know it seems to be a no-brainer, but you really have to put this in place. Freeze all non-essential spending for the remainder of the year. Freeze hiring at the current vacancy level. So there are some vacancies that have been created since the budget began, and you really don't want to fill those positions in light of a bad financial outlook. Our second recommendation is that you go through the budget division by division to see if there are additional opportunities for savings. Because in my experience, as you go through the budget, you are going to see other areas. Now, the first area of savings will basically contribute about $1.4 million toward that fund balance figure that you were given. So if we go through freeze all essential spending, we believe that you'll save at least $1.4 million. So you get to add that back to whatever that fund balance figure that you were given before.
Is that a calculation for the whole year, or is that?
That is a calculation for the whole year. I mean, basically, if you do what we're talking about doing now, you've already saved some of it. We're saying basically you should be able to get to about $1.4 million if you freeze at this point.
Hey, Mr. Thomas, can you please give us your definition as best you can of non-essential spending versus essential spending?
Well, I think Mr. Priester mentioned at one time before about priority-based budgeting. So as you go through all the different funds, you're going to make a priority of where you can spend, where you can't. So Ms. Day has already communicated you're going to have to spend some additional funds on policing. That's already considered in the reductions. The additional expenses, but there are other areas, other departments that are not as critical as policing and fire and fire protection.
I realize that.
That's really the nature of it.
I realize that. I was asking what the specifics are. I mean, for the purposes of, I'm very curious what are the non-essential spending in the city? If you can give me any specifics.
I guess that's kind of a loaded question because the assumption is that everything there is essential, but in a crisis, you got to make some determination of what you will do to spare the budget. So I don't want to get into really just the issue of calling an apartment non-essential. What I'm saying really is, if you've been able to do without it for a period of time, perhaps you can do without it for the remainder of the year. So example would be, you haven't filled a position. Departments then figure out how to work around not having that position there in order to spare the budget. You may want to just not fill that position going to the end of the year. Likewise, you've spent some funds on paper and supplies and all those things that help the city operate. To a certain degree, you may not have to spend that same amount going forward. And so you go through the budget, you call it out, and you make a determination of what you have to spend in order to provide the services that the city wants to provide, and then there are going to be some things that you don't. I will also mention, you know, normally you might look at a budget and say, okay, well, we'll look at equipment, for example. We may be able to delay equipment purchases that are still in the budget now till we can plan better for those purchases next year. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. Not that you know, they're not essential for operation. It may be that you're able to defer them till a later point.
Who would sit down with, or who in city government will make these tough decisions?
Well, I think Miss Day in the mayor's office, Miss Horton, who already sits with departments every quarter, will have to sit with them again and go through. And I will tell you, just sitting in on that process is a very good process. Ms. Horton is very good in how she communicates where departments are. And I think at this point, knowing the financial outlook for the city, that's going to be a fairly easy conversation.
If I could add, Mr. Thomas was saying the administration and the mayor, but I think it should be a process that includes you all as well, because as we determine what the priorities are for our city, we need your input too. So if we could bring each department before you and go line by line of what their services are, we need to determine as a body what we say we will not continue to do and stick to those core services.
All right. Question. I thought we already froze everything that we reasonably could freeze when we did the 15-16 budget.
We did, but there were some positions that were
Not frozen.
Yeah, during conversations with the departments, positions that they said that they needed and made justification for them, those positions were left unfrozen. So we're saying if there are some above and beyond what we have already frozen, let's freeze those as well.
And do we know how many in between when we adopted the budget in September, leaving those positions unfrozen, do we have a feel for how many of those have actually gotten filled so far?
I would have to check with personnel. The only thing we've really been filling is public works positions, and I'll say in maybe a few in police. But again, the hiring has been very limited, but I can get that information to you.
Okay, and I'm sorry, this is sort of backtracking, but I just realized I had this on my page in my notes. So the 14-15 budget, when we adopted it, was it meeting the 7.5% reserve?
No, it was adopted using that 14 million of fund balance. We didn't use the entire 14 million. When we closed out, we only used 11 million, which created that deficit. So the 7.5 was there, just say September 30th. But when we adopted that budget for 14-15, we dipped into the fund balance.
Okay, so in September 2013, we had
2014.
No, I'm saying for 13, our budget it met the 7.5% reserve?
Yes.
All right, and then we're in September of 2014, adopting the 14, I'm sorry. Yeah.
You're right, adopted a 14-15 budget.
Adopting 14-15. And you're saying when we adopted 14-15, we adopted a budget that did not meet the 7.5% reserve?
Yes.
If you recall, it was at that time where we really started talking about priority-based budgeting, and we started the first phase of priority-based budgeting during the last budget cycle because what we said was that we could no longer afford to dip into fund balance. And that was one of the sole purpose for us going to priority-based budgeting this last budget cycle. So again, this fund balance issue has been looming since we did that 14 million dip.
All right. So why do we say in our CAFR for 14-15 that we do meet our 7.5%?
The 15 CAFR is not out yet.
No, I'm sorry, for
13-14. You did meet at 13-14.
All right.
So in this CAFR that is the audit that's scheduled to be released tomorrow, it will reflect that we did not meet it.
Now, I can remember, if I remember correctly, we did discuss some means that we could save and cut. And you asked the council to make recommendations also. And I remember making some recommendations. And I don't know what really happened. We have a thorough discussion on priority budgeting. We knew we was in trouble,
Yes, sir.
but we did not take proper steps to save the budget as we planned.
I'm sorry, Mr. Tim, could you repeat that last part?
I got it. What he's saying is that, and you're right, Mr. Tillman, we proposed a budget last year that was extremely unpopular. It included some things that, to be honest with you, could have made many of us unelectable, and we chose not to go that route. And so several of the cuts that we were intending to make we did not make, and we adopted a different budget. We literally adopted a budget that did not have the capacity to keep up with the same amount of services that we were asking departments to keep up with.
I've got to respond to that. I think that's a completely inaccurate depiction of what happened with the budget process. I don't want to bog this down, but that's just not accurate. Mr. Stamps.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we proposed last year during the budget process, it was a great process. The work product, I believe, has some areas where it could have been better. If we're going to propose a different budget than the administration puts forward next year, if we're going to adopt something different, we need to bring forth and build our own budget. But just hacking away at what's presented is not an efficient way because it's a fluid process. These departments work together between departments, and if you can just cut here and cut there, but you don't understand how they connect, it breaks down the execution of the budget. And so if we're going to do that this year, I think we need to have a little bit more advice in that process. I believe that Mr. Hill and Mr. Thomas will be here through the end of that budget process. So we'll be needing that kind of input to understand how the departments work together, because if you just cut this department, cut that department, don't understand how they connect, it makes the execution of that process a little worse. I'm going to have to leave. I planned for just a quick overview. I didn't know this was going to be like a budget hearing. So I'll just have to watch the presentations from the Public Works Department. I do appreciate y'all for coming, and I'll look forward to going over these matters once they're presented.
Sure. I mean, I'll just, in response to your last point, the only difference between the originally presented budget from the administration and what was ultimately adopted basically did what Mr. Thompson suggested, which was freeze a bunch of unfilled positions and cut to the zoo, cut outside agency funding to instead doing a tax increase. We asked specifically what would be needed not to do a tax increase and identified cuts commensurate to that amount. And nothing we've seen presented so far indicates that the cuts that we made weren't at issue. I mean, it sounds like Mr. Thompson's saying we need to do more of what we proposed. So,
what we need to do is look at the lowering of taxes in 2014 is questionable. We lowered taxes. We all remember the taxes were lowered by what, 5.5 mils?
but I remind you, that was because of one-time money. Just put the taxes back where they were. But let's get back to Mr. Thomas, because we can't get distracted forever. And
So let me just kind of run through the initial recommendations that I have for you on page 3 and 4 are primarily designed to generate some additional revenue opportunities. I have on here that you need to review all contracts for possible opportunities for renegotiation. I believe several weeks ago, the gentleman that has the signed contracts, he said that he had tried to renegotiate his contract several times and wasn't successful. So I asked Ms. Day to secure a copy of those contracts, and looking at them, those contracts expired in 1891, and he's been operating under the same revenue figure for that period of time. So there's obviously some opportunity to generate additional revenue by renegotiating those contracts and possibly other contracts that are within the city. So that's, again, going through and calling through the budgets to see who has contracts out there, what's the status of those contracts, and if there's an opportunity to renegotiate.
Mr. Thomas, looking at the first page of this budget that's got all the general property taxes, license and permits, where does the contracts you're talking about renegotiating, which line item is that, are those part of?
Yeah, I think you may be looking at the revenue portion of the budget, and I'm talking more about the expenditure portion where.
Wait, if you renegotiate a contract.
I'm sorry, the revenue for the static billboards, I don't know exactly where they.
That would be
are.
revenue, not expense.
They would be, but you're not getting a whole lot from that anyway.
I agree. I just wanted to find out which line item that you're talking about as a source of potential revenue, which it should be fall under.
Yeah, I think Michelle can give you that. What I wanted to say to that, though, was, so there are revenue contracts out there that could possibly be renegotiated, but there are also expenditure contracts out there where you're spending money for services that could be renegotiated to save money.
Okay.
So that's a part of that recommendation. It's not just on the revenue side, it's on the expenditure side as well. Also, as we went through and analyzed finance, we discovered that departments have their own individual, in some cases, their own copier contracts. And so there may be an opportunity to eliminate all the various contracts for copiers and just have one citywide contract that'll save money and generate probably more services too, depending on how you do it. In addition to that, there are energy saving contracts that are possible. Not necessarily referencing the one for the water sewer, but more so designed to save funds on your usage of energy and create a revenue source. I cited the city of D'Iberville because they are currently considering a program that would generate some savings through solar and also generate, I think through the same process, they're going to be given a number of electric cars that and charging stations built around the city of D'Iberville that the city can use free of charge, won't have maintenance, won't have gas, and might create some saving opportunity by taking cars that do require gas and service out of the fleet. So there's an opportunity to look, and there's a potential for savings. I also recommend that you pursue a health savings account. Looking at where you are on insurance, there's always this thought, well, insurance, one way that you can reduce the cost of your insurance program is you raise the deductible. But obviously, you raise the deductible, you negatively impact the individuals who have that policy. There is an opportunity through some medical savings account where you can increase that deductible. It'll have a net zero effect to the employee because the employee will have access to a medical reimbursement account that will save them the money that they would have spent on the deductible anyway, but you get to raise the deductible and lower your premium. So I've had some conversations with Ms. Whitehead, I believe, that is managing that health insurance program. And so she's given me some tentative figures. I think you need to explore that. The other side of that is you also get an opportunity to save on payroll taxes. And my preliminary projection on how much you can save on payroll taxes is about $1.4 million a year. So even if you implement it between now and the end of the year, you might be able to save $500,000 to $600,000 just from this point to the end of the year. So I have had some conversations with the administration about getting someone to come in, give a proposal. We did have another presentation, I think yesterday, on something very similar. So I do think that there's an opportunity to bring that in, to provide additional benefits to the employees, but also save the city on some of the payroll tax matching requirements. And like I said, provide additional benefits to the employees. In one situation, you can provide as much as $1,000 a year additional take-home pay to the employee at the same time. So the employer benefits the city of Jackson by to the tune of about $1.4 million. The employee benefits to the tune of roughly $2 million, which is roughly $1,000 per employee. But you also get an opportunity to reduce your, to raise your deductible and hopefully reduce your premium on the health insurance to put it back in a manageable level. So that's like I said, a health savings account. And I've provided some information, but I would love to at some point soon start receiving some presentations on that thing to help the city save money. I put in here, releasing an RFP for parking meters. I think I've seen where it's been put together. While it may not fix the problem right now, it is going to generate additional revenue going forward. So I would say on anything that generates additional revenue, the mantra needs to be to do it as soon as possible. And one recommendation that's not grouped in this initial group of 8 is a recommendation that was mentioned on municipal court. There is a challenge keeping people there. The people that you're having challenges with are in the business of collecting on those funds. So our recommendation is that you consider using those funds that you would have paid for your salaries to engage additional collecting agencies and let them pursue those funds. The opportunity that you have there is you can actually measure how well the different collecting agencies do, and those that do a particularly better job at collecting might need to get the brunt of the city's business going forward. So that is a recommendation. Some of the other recommendations are more departmental kind of improvement in nature. They'll improve efficiency, but they're not designed to bring in as much revenue as some of the recommendations I've already discussed. And all of these recommendations will be packaged in the preliminary report that we're going to give the city on Monday.
All right. I've got to go back to this point about the 16 budget being built not meeting the reserve. Here's an email that I wrote on August 28, 2015 to you, Mr. Mayor, and you, Director Jones, and I specifically said, we think that some of the additional cuts you propose will have an adverse impact on the city. Fortunately, it looks like the total numbers are close enough now that with some minor changes, we should be able to meet our reserve fund requirement without making these cuts. The response I got was, from Director Jones, was, thank you, Ms. Jones has delineated the changes to us and we are amenable to these further adjustments. We will make the necessary adjustments and we'll have a new balanced budget to you by Tuesday. That was response on August 29th, 2015. I further point to our CAFR at page 43, where it specifically says, replenishment of reserve deficits. If at the end of any fiscal year, the actual amount of unassigned fund balance or unassigned net position falls below the required fund levels set forth herein, the mayor shall prepare and submit a plan for expenditure expense reductions and or revenue increases to the city council. As part of the annual budget review, the city council shall review and if necessary, amend the plan submitted by the mayor for restoring the amounts of unassigned fund balance or unassigned net positions to the required level. Again, that's page 43 from the notes to financial statements of the city of Jackson. So again, maybe this is a case of you say tomato, I say tomato, but it seems as though when we entered into the budget in August and September 2015, we specifically asked whether or not the numbers presented met the reserve, and were told that they were.
Well, as it relates to the city's plan of action that the mayor is to submit, I think you'll find in tomorrow's release that there is a plan of action. I can read it to you now, or you can wait to receive it on tomorrow.
Please read it now.
All right, so the city's plan of action Letter A, the city's proposed financial plan includes the establishment of a budget stabilization fund, which will provide a mechanism by which funds which exceed budget needs, including the required fund balance, may be set aside. B, the city must redefine its core services. The provision of these services will be our primary focus as we continue to build our reserves. The city has historically provided services that extend beyond public safety, water and wastewater and infrastructure, streets and bridges, management. Our citizens have benefited tremendously from these services, but the cost of providing them has begun to drain the city of much needed resources, which has affected the city's ability to provide the core services. The city must continue to explore, create, and implement additional revenue streams. For example, parking meters, explore ways to monetize the city's assets, explore private management of certain city facilities. The city will place priority and allocate resources in areas where the city generates revenue. Letter D, the hiring of all non-essential personnel will be suspended. Letter E, all non-emergency overtime and overtime not previously approved by the department director will be suspended. Letter F, requests for non-emergency purchases and travel will be suspended. Letter G, reduce funding provided to outside agencies until the city has rebuilt its reserves. Letter H, discontinue the youth employment and summer enrichment programs until the city has built its reserves. Letter I, the city must be proactive in its efforts to eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse. The auditor's recommendation is what initiated this. The auditors stated that the city should take the appropriate steps to adhere to its fund balance net position policy at fiscal year end. This will ensure that the city maintains a reasonable level of unexpended reserves that will allow it to plan against unanticipated expenditures, revenue shortfalls, or both. Additionally, city officials should ensure that the level of reserves maintained is sufficient to provide adequate cash flow. What we did not do was simply peg this as city plan of action earlier.
Do you have anything further to report, Mr. Thompson? Yes. All right. I think we've covered a great deal of ground today. I want to thank everyone for their hard work. This isn't pleasant when you start the numbers on what the numbers are, and they're a reality you have to face. So,
Mr. President, we're going to pull item number 2.
are you sure?
Positive.
All right. Do you want to reschedule for a different date?
Yes, sir. We're going to reschedule. We'll send to the clerk potential dates and see how that works with the council. Thank you.
Meeting is adjourned.
Whichever way is best. Hey man. Whichever way is best. Yeah.